first thing out of my mouth was, please don't judge me based on what you knew. I'm not that person anymore. McLeod Life presents the Grief and Gratitude podcast hosted by me, Raquel McLeod. This will be a safe space for conversations about adoption and kinship care that I've cultivated organically through lived experience, education, and community. I hope that you leave feeling seen or encouraged, but ultimately better equipped to move forward. I'm so glad that you're here today for the launch of my very first podcast, Grief and Gratitude. If you're watching on YouTube, I talk with my hands a lot. I apologize, and I'm learning how to look at the camera. So hopefully that's not distracting and you stick it through with me. If you're listening on a podcast streaming service, I'm so glad to be in your ear today, and I hope that you enjoy this, and I would love to hear your feedback after you finish the episode. I knew whenever I decided to launch a new podcast that I would need to do an introduction episode, but the thought of that seemed so silly because I've been advocating within the adoption and kinship care spaces for over 2 years now. But truthfully, there's going to be things that you hear today that maybe you didn't know already, no matter how long you've followed along. And for the people that are new, it seems like a lot because it is. So I'll insert my trigger warning here. A lot of my story is heavy, and that's just how it is. That's what brought me to where I'm at. That is the why behind why I do what I do. I am incredibly familiar with the lack of resources, specifically for birth mothers and kinship care providers, and it's my lived experience that gave me that insight and truly, I guess, encouraged me to use my lived experience to advocate for better. And so that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. And to understand the why, I think you have to hear pieces of my story. I'm just going to share an overview, not full details that'll come later in future episodes, but I do want to just hit on a lot of the major life events that have influenced me to be the woman that I am today. If you make it through all the hard and heavy, at the end of this episode, I am going to give you 10 silly, not serious, fun facts about me. My Instagram community had requested that in stories the other day. That was the second most requested thing, so I'm going to deliver. I don't really know how to segue into sharing my story, so let's just dive into it. 20 years ago, I was 15 years old and about 2 months away from delivering my first daughter. It's a situation that a lot of people have questioned, considering that I've never shared the circumstances surrounding my pregnancy. And if you're going to share online, you better have thick skin. Let me read a few things that have been said to me. Were you abused? Must have been rape. Stupid and careless. Too fast and too young. Where were your parents? Just another dumb slut. Why don't you stop glorifying teen pregnancy? Are you proud of this? A hurt for all the ignorance that abounds, but I will not accept these words. Their toxicity will not seep into the marrow of who I am, because these strangers do not define my worth. I was born into chaos. My biological parents were young, unwed addicts, and even though my biological father tried to convince me that they tried to conceive me, I think that was his way of grasping for normalcy. I think he was really stretching to try to make me feel like I had been wanted and planned. My grandparents petitioned the courts for custody when I was around 2 years old. Child welfare was not involved. I was not a child of the foster care system. It was originally informal arrangements that they later took through the court system privately, with my biological mother's permission for TPR and my biological father's refusal. So they shared custody with him and just made him aware that they were in charge of my well-being. But this happened in the late 80s, early 90s, and for what few resources we have now, there were even fewer back then. So there was no talk of healthy boundaries or creating clear safety and stability for me. And I grew up in the South, and there's this culture there that blood is thicker than water. My father really was a kind-hearted man, but he was bound to addiction. So my entire childhood was moments of normalcy tucked in between moments of chaos. It's no secret that I'm new to podcasting, so I don't really have sponsorships or commercial intermissions that are necessary, but I do want to get in the habit of promoting other people or organizations or brands that I feel are adding value to my listeners or could be adding value to my listeners' lives. So one place that I want to direct you is belovedinitiative.org. This nonprofit was founded by Tori Hope Peterson, and she wrote the book Fostered. Incredible read. If you haven't added that to your library yet or checked it out from your local library, I highly suggest it. But Tori created this retreat for survivors, and the whole purpose is to encourage you to not just survive, but to thrive, and to equip you to share your story to ultimately help others. I attended their retreat back in October of last year. And not only was Tori just absolutely precious, but the group of women that I met there, many of us with similar backgrounds, different types of survivors, different types of abuse, and different types of writers. We had, poets, people that were wanting to write memoirs, just really the whole gambit. And it was just a phenomenal opportunity. And I believe Beloved Initiative just announced last week that they are taking submissions for upcoming writing retreats. And I want to suggest that if you are a writer and a survivor and you have a story that you want to get out, or if you know someone, I would highly suggest going to belovedinitiative.org and filling out the request form to join a future retreat. Super happy to share Beloved Initiative with y'all, but now back to the story. I smoked my first cigarette at 12 years old after experiencing what I now know was depression and anxiety, all stemming from unaddressed childhood trauma. Just a bit shy of my 13th birthday, I began self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. I became promiscuous and relied heavily on the validation of boys and men to fill the emptiness that I felt. I continued to spiral until I stood in a bathroom staring at a positive pregnancy test when I was 14 years old. My guardianship was transferred. I moved 700 miles away and was given the ultimatum: you'll either make an adoption plan or you won't have a home to live in. I wasn't very aware of what my rights were, but I knew that my unborn child deserved better than a 14-year-old homeless mother. So I started crafting an adoption plan with the agency that my guardians provided. It was hard. I think it would have been hard under good circumstances, but my home was becoming increasingly abusive. I had to adjust to a new house, a new state, a new school, a new body. After delivering, I expected to hurt and then move toward healing, but I was confronted with a new normal. Consistent abuse, verbal, mental, but worst of all, sexual. And so I couldn't work on healing because I had to figure out how to survive. 2 years later, I realized that if I didn't get out, I might not get out alive. I was exhausted and broken, and I knew that I had to escape. And so a few months after my 17th birthday, I ran away. I was picked up as a runaway, and by the grace of God, released. I was able to get emancipated. I was physically free, but the voices in my head were so loud that I picked up smoking and drinking again, just trying to drown the demons and live a happy life. That's really all I wanted. I soon met my now husband, fell in love, got engaged, got married, and 6 months into marriage, held our first positive pregnancy test. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. Our daughter had just turned 3, and I'd been a stay-at-home mom for about 6 months when we became kinship caregivers for my biological newborn half-sister. It was around this time that I remember I was sitting in a church pew listening to a pastor talk about unfortunate life circumstances and how if we chose to, God could use those for the good of others. And it was the first time in my life that I'd felt a sense of purpose in my pain. Not that I believe that God orchestrates these horrendous circumstances to draw us closer to Him or to use us as an asset for others, but I feel like if we allow Him to, He can cultivate beauty from ashes. I immediately knew that high school ministry was where my heart was, and so I was terrified, and I avoided it for many, many months. I remember when I went to speak to the high school minister at the church we were attending, and he recognized me. I didn't recognize him, but I guess we had went to school together. And the first thing out of my mouth was, "Please don't judge me based on what you knew. I'm not that person anymore." He laughed. We had a really great conversation. I got to know his wife and was so relieved to be able to use pieces of my story to help other young girls feel seen and validated. I was a safe space. I was getting to be what I always needed when I was their age. And I don't think anything else in this life can compare to that level of relief when you've carried such a heavy story for so long. It was probably just a few weeks later that I was at the park with the girls. I remember hearing the water fountain splashing in the background, kids laughing, but it was the adoption agency calling to let me know that my birth daughter wanted to meet me, and her parents were wondering if I was okay with planning a visit. Up to that point, had been led to believe that I wouldn't be allowed to meet her until she turned 18 if she chose to find me. My life changed dramatically in that moment. It was not a cure-all for the depression or the grief that I carried around. The grief that I carry from placing, I think, will always be a part of my life, even now, almost 20 years later. But it absolutely impacted me in a positive way. It's only gotten better since. That was 11 years ago now, and she turns 20 this summer. We continued to raise my biological sister, and a few years later, the father that we shared passed away, And with her birth mother's permission, we finalized her adoption just a few months shy of her 5th birthday. I've worked incredibly hard to utilize my lived experience to cultivate a healthier reality for her. So all of this kind of connected 2 years ago. I was sharing, I don't know, maybe just everyday life content, marriage content on Instagram. And my oldest daughter had flown in to visit, and I just shared a small clip of her coming in. We surprised her little sisters with the visit. They didn't know she was coming, and it went viral. Something about this video struck a chord with over 19 million people. And based on the comments that I got from that video, I realized how needed education was for the birth mother experience. On one hand, I was selfless. I was this birth mother that had blessed another family. And on the other hand, I was villainized. I was this unfeeling, uncaring woman that didn't deserve to have more children of my own. And somewhere in the middle is where I actually was. This scared young girl with no support system that was forced into making an adoption plan, which ultimately was better for my child because I didn't have a safe home or a healthy support system, but was still this incredibly heavy grief and this very real trauma that grafted itself into my very being and became something that I would carry around for the rest of my life. And all I saw was hundreds of thousands of voices that had not known me, had not known my story, had not experienced what I experienced, judging me based on 10 seconds of my life. But on the flip side, there were hundreds of thousands of strangers resonating, saying, I've not met another birth mother and I finally don't feel so alone. Or I've never had the opportunity to meet my birth mother, but seeing how you've processed this and how you love your daughter has been healing for me. I knew in that moment that that's where I was being called to hold space and to use my story and to pull from my experiences to help others. Because ultimately I know there's all these different ideas now of put yourself first, just do what makes you feel best. And to a degree, we do have to respect our boundaries. We have to respect our mental capacity. We have to acknowledge how much we have to pour out, but we are meant to pour out. Because when we stay self-focused, life becomes a lot heavier. We were not meant to live without community. We were not meant to be focused on self. And so it became just very apparent to me that this was what I was passionate about. This is how I was going to use my story to help others, and in the process it would help me heal along the way too. I have no doubt that throughout the journey of this podcast I'll have ample opportunity to share more detailed stories that help connect the dots for the education and the resources that I'm so passionate about curating for the adoption and kinship care community. With that said, I promised 10 silly, fun facts about me. I gotta find them. So if you are listening on the podcast, I apologize that you won't get to see this. For those watching on YouTube, I'm going to try to find images to match some of these. Number 1, I grew up in the pumpkin house. My grandpa was the pumpkin man, and I was in the newspaper every fall with all of our pumpkins. Number 2, I haven't ate meat since I was 9 years old, and I'm 35, so you do the math. Number 3, I was called Rocky throughout childhood. It was a legitimate nickname and one that I outgrew. In elementary school, I believed that God made you pregnant, so I would pray to him every night that I could be a mama one day when I grew up, until Jill ruined it and told me how babies are really made. Number 5, I can juggle. And that used to be a really fun fact. It was my go-to that I always told people until I was challenged to a juggling contest. We were sitting around a campfire with new friends we had just met at a campground, and the husband was like, I can juggle too. Let's see who can do it better. Spoiler alert, he could. Number 6. My favorite drink is water, and yes, I do believe that not all waters taste the same. I can taste a difference, and I'm kind of a water snob. Number 7, I won an Earth Day button design contest when I was in elementary school. They just told us the premise of Earth Day and wanted us to design like a little pin button. And my design won, and they had a big ceremony at a local park where they acknowledged me and handed out hundreds of these little buttons with my artwork on it. Number 8, I lost count of how many tattoos I have a long time ago, but I've given myself 8 because I really wanted to learn how to tattoo, so I bought the equipment, and my husband and a few friends, countless subpar tattoos too. Number 9, I like to rollerblade, but I'd always done it on blacktop or skating rinks and felt way too confident and cocky at 18 years old, and I went to a skate park for the very first time, and it ended with me on a stretcher with a sprained neck. So I didn't do that again. Number 10, this one makes me cringe. My worst entrepreneurial venture was the time that I thought I would make barnwood signs, but I used old dirty barnwood. I didn't sand it, didn't clean it, just straight out of Grandpa's barn, cut it down to size, and puff paint to paint designs on it, and twine to hang it with. And no one had the heart to tell me that it was a terrible idea. And I even set up at a craft show with those suckers. Yeah, I'll never forget it. I'm so glad that you chose to spend some of your day with me. I imagine with each episode I'm going to get a little less awkward, but the only way to find that out is to hit the subscribe button and tune in next week when we start talking about the birth mother experience in honor of Mother's Day for May. So can't wait to see you then.